This is Michael Deibert, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
It's interesting. Michael Deibert is one of the most qualified people in talking about Central, South America, Caribbean, Haiti, especially. And I wanted to start because a mutual friend of ours, Kelly Lowry, is he's one of the people that goes to Haiti and tries to do good things there. And it's just so hard. We've been there. Gosh, we've been there forever. What are the things, Michael, that I think is illustrative of the problem of Haiti is, well, obviously the imbalance of, and I'm saying prosperity with quoted fingers because it all depends on how you look at this, the island of Hispaniola and how it's diverse. Like there's a line, you can see it where the deforestation is complete. And the other side, not that the Dominican Republic is booming with all kinds of revenue, but there's some health there. Haiti, Hispaniola is 1,400 miles from Houston. Houston is 2,300 miles from Seattle. Dramatically different places. One of them desperate for help and stability, and no one seems to be able to crack the code.
Yeah, I mean, I think 1997, and I've been going there pretty consistently ever since. I lived there for several years in the early 2000s. And I think one of the things to understanding the situation in Haiti is that the problems are systemic and structural. In other words, they're bigger than any one political figure or even one political party. So you have a system been created whereby strata of economic and political who profit off of kind of corruption and impunity and are guaranteed trying to keep that going. Another thing that I think is often not talked about is there were some placed by the US, especially in the 80s and in the 90s. 80s, there was a program co-funded by the US and Canada that eradicated the Creole pig because they thought it had African swine fever. So that basically was one of the backbones of the peasant economy. And for many of them, they were never replaced. Then in the mid 90s, you had a situation, in 1991, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was the leader at the, and in order to try to pressure, the military regime to bring him back, what they instituted this economic embargo on Haiti, which basically destroyed the middle class that was at the time just hanging on by their fingernails. And then when he came back, they, Bill Clinton, who also, instituted this embargo, helped usher through this whole, what they call the structural adjustment plan. So basically what that was lowering the tariff on imported rice from something like 35% to 3%. So you had all of this imported rice flooding to Haiti that the local farmers couldn't compete with. And so the local farmers couldn't compete with the low price. And what they ended up doing was flooding to the big cities in search of work that wasn't there because the middle class had been destroyed a couple of years earlier. And basically what ended up happening was you had a bunch of very impoverished people from the whose kids then provided an inexhaustible supply of recruits for these illegal armed groups. If you have a bunch of young guys with no time, nothing on a lot of time on their hands and no gainful employment. I mean, that's a recipe for trouble, whether you're in Pennsylvania or Haiti or California or wherever.
This is a huge point. When I would go abroad to places Iraq and Afghanistan, same thing, same problem. One of the things I would look for when I talked to the locals, which was all the time, that was part of my job, was to constantly interact, is to figure out like if these guys could dream, if they thought they had a future, if they thought they were gainfully employable. And the answer was always no. There is no dream. There is no hope. There's just I'm not allowed to, and then a list of everything. And so you have these people that are eminently exploitable. That's just the bottom line. If someone chooses to, yeah.
And what was always really striking to me is, I mean, with the kind of first generation of these illegal armed groups, I mean, they're called generally now the base is in Creole. But when I was young, when I was a journalist in the early 2000s, called the Chimère, which means kind of like a nightmare. And they were basically, that template was created by the Famille Lavalas party and Jean-Bertrand Aristide. Now it has since metastasized, so every political entity in Haiti has their gunmen. But these guys, this first generation, you know, um, I became friends with a lot of them, and sometimes I would take them to what you would say, kind of normal functions, like if some people were having a dinner or something like that. I mean, I was a journalist, so I wasn't making very much money, and I lived in a kind of middle class neighborhood. But because these guys were so poor, even a middle class neighborhood was extremely, affluent. And you would take them to these situations, and they would be the most polite, meek guys. They would not drink to excess, so the once you took them out of the craziness that they had been living in, you could see that there was a different person in there waiting to come out who had not had the opportunity. And now there's some organizations in Haiti, La Paix, which means peaceful community, basically in Creole. That's one organization that does the really hard work with some of these very marginalized people in these poor neighborhoods. But the problem is, I guess, is that politics and the endless political wars that have now been going on for more than 20 years have destroyed the economy. So what can you offer these young people, besides the little money they're getting from politicians to, crase brise, burn shit down, basically. And there's not a whole lot of options in Haiti right now, like, some other places in the world.
One of the things that we often say when it's so hard to discuss this stuff because it's so complex, and I'm trying to make sure we tease it out because I've been to unstable areas where we're doing our damnedest to try to help, right? And there's just this repeating problem that I've noticed, and I'm writing about it now in a book, trying to explain something that's very hard to explain. We go with the best intentions and we'll say that is a corrupt place. However, we are the corruption. We are the corruptors. So chicken and egg, was it corrupt? Is it corrupt because there's not enough stuff there? Is it corrupt because the people are corrupt? Are people who were corrupt uncorruptible? And then is it possible to do any of that if we're there constantly just pushing corruption into the system,
Yeah, and I mean, I think also, especially, I mean, in Haiti, there's a famous phrase that gets repeated that it's the Republic of NGOs, and I mean, you have these big organizations that come in with these huge budgets, and they're in these mansions and things like that. And some of them have really good intentions and really care and really want to help the people. And you have other, usually in the upper echelons. I mean, there's I have a story of a friend of mine who was having drinks with one of the heads of one of the big international organizations, not even an NGO. And this guy turns to him and said, poverty has been very good to me. So, I mean, how about the cynicism of that? Um, and I think, whether it's in Haiti or whether it's in Iraq or whether it's somewhere like that, the most revolutionary thing you can do is strengthen an institution. So if you have a strong and independent judiciary, if you have a professional, non-political police force, that stuff means a lot in getting the people to believe that that there's a government there rather than just a regime, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The problem is with that is there are regimes there, and they come and they cut the head off of the institutional snake quite
Yeah.
frequently, whether it's a police chief or, I mean, getting robbed at gunpoint and left for dead or dead is a common thing that happens to people that have too much influence and power for the system. It almost drags itself down.
Well, look at the absurdity of the situation in Haiti now. Okay, the president was murdered in July of last year, and the guy who's currently serving as the interim prime minister, with the blessing of the United States and the international community, as far as I can tell, I mean, his phone was burning up with calls back and forth between one of the alleged masterminds of the killing the day of,
Mm.
you know. And like, if you're a Haitian and you're looking at the international community backing this guy, why would you have faith in them? I wouldn't. I mean, and that's just one of the most brazen examples. But I kind of, when they talk about stability, that seems, I mean, having a potential assassin as the prime minister running the country doesn't seem particularly stable to me. But what do I know?
Yeah, and when you're starving to death and you're energy poor and there's no way out, I mean, I always like to look at the United States when I work in conflict zones, like, are we really any different? And I'm not promoting any kind of a theory or anything, but when you look at Anthony Fauci and who he's married to, you have to go, well, there's a conflict of interest here. Like, I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong, but if you don't want conspiracy theories to abound, you have to act like, like you want to prevent that from happening. And when you don't, when you have conflict of interest, you have people sitting on each other's boards and all these other things, people start to lose faith, even in the American system. And our system is extremely stable in terms of internationally, if you look at it. So when you look at a place like Haiti, where you already don't trust one another, and it's already unsafe on a day-to-day basis for almost anybody, it's really hard to create that stability, and really, honestly, instability is the norm in a place like Haiti, right?
Well, one thing I would say that is the great chasm in Haiti is essentially I find that the interlocutors of the international community, kind of the political and economic elite, are often the least patriotic and the most dangerous in the country. The average Haitian person who gets up every morning, probably with no electricity, probably having to go get water, sits on a tap to go to a job that's paying them maybe $2 a day, those extremely patriotic. And I feel like they really have a sense of the nation of Haiti. And that's, something that unfortunately, because of this gap we were talking about, doesn't usually translate to the political system. I mean, that, and, um, I think a lot of it is, I mean, something that's very impressive always to me, at least, is the knowledge of the intricacies of Haitian history that the average Haitian has, that I think even a lot of Americans don't have about the United States. I mean, most Haitians can tell you chapter and verse about the revolutionary battles that Toussaint and Dessalines fought against the French and what the significance was and things like that. And I mean, that's something that I always find is really uh, something to be proud of. I mean, when the rest of the hemisphere basically was still kind of languishing as colonies, the Haitians were like, I don't like the system very much.
Yeah.
Okay, to fight, we'll fight you for 13 years and win and kick the French out, and I think however much problems there are in Haiti now, that's something that can never be taken away from the country, in a lot of ways they are the children of heroes, as the author Lionel Trouillot called them.
Is there a lever, like, let's make you the president of the United States today, and you're like, one of my things I know a lot about is Haiti. We're gonna fix this thing. Is there a lever that you would pull, or is this a system of levers that you have to pull? And understanding that as a president, you can't actually do any of this. You have to entrust somebody else, NGOs, State Department, whoever it is, to go do this thing. Is this even fixable?
I mean, one of the examples I always use of something that I thought was really effective is, okay, at the end of the Civil War in Guatemala had a 30-year civil war. It ended in the mid 1990s. And one of the agreements that came out of the peace agreements between the government and the rebels was that they were going to set up what they called the Commission against impunity in Guatemala, and it was basically this UN supported body that investigated organized crime and illegal armed groups and their relations to state, non-state political and economic actors. And in the years of its existence, it had an incredible record of success, up to and including jailing a sitting president. Um, that I think, that example is salutary for Haiti. And some people might say, well, Haiti is not in a civil war. Well, I could take you around some neighborhoods in Port-au-Prince, and I'm sure it would feel like a civil war. I mean, I can tell you from personal experience. I mean, there's a lot of heavily armed characters going around with daggers drawn at one another. And that an entity like that, I think, it really could help in terms of giving people a little bit of faith back that there is a system on their side, that they're not, that just when some honest person stands up, it's not just one person waiting to get their head chopped off, metaphorically and sometimes literally.
Yeah.
That there's actually some interest, because for the international community, it seems like historically they have this obsession in Haiti with elections, 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 and elections are not really, the country has gotten worse since the mid 90s with all of the elections. And it's not, I don't think, really responsive to the needs of the people, in the sense of you have elections and it's just elections at gunpoint where guys show up and say, here's money to vote for me, or if you don't vote for me, I'll kill you, and stuff like that. And so the system continues just with this window of holding a vote every couple of years. And so I think you need some, like the one I just described, such as was in Guatemala, to confront that structural problem and give people a little bit of confidence back in the system.
If they'll take it. if they'll take that system and say, yeah, this represents us. One of the problems that I saw especially in Iraq, is you could wrap your hands around a pretty prime problem, one of the elemental things. And the moment you tried to increase the availability of whatever it is that was not in excess, the tribal part you couldn't wrestle with. So you go to the Deibert clan would be like, hey, where's, the Turners have all this stuff. When are we getting ours? And it could literally be right there in their thing, but they won't accept it. And then the specter of the problem was always so much more of a problem, where you could be perfectly safe outside, but if you didn't believe it, you wouldn't go outside. And we see this with like COVID, where people are terrified to leave the house, haven't left the house in 2 years, that kind of thing, right? And so there's the specter that we're fighting.
You haven't left the house in 2 years?
No, I know people that are like this, that are
Oh,
still
okay.
afraid because, and
Okay.
rightfully so. Like, I'm not denigrating that, but I'm saying that there's a specter that you're always fighting, this illusion of this problem, as opposed to the actual problem itself, which is its own problem.
Where I've never been to Iraq. I've read quite a bit about it. But where were you based there?
Lots of places,
Yeah.
northern Iraq, some central, lots of Baghdad, some southern Iraq, lots and lots of different places. So I got a really good sampling of what this instability looked like. Yeah.
Did you ever read? I don't know if you ever heard of a journalist called Anthony Shadid, who died in Syria about 10 years ago, but he wrote a book about Iraq called Night Draws Near, which is one of the best pieces of war reporting I've ever read. I mean, really, he was a Lebanese American who grew up in Oklahoma. So he was at once like completely American guy from Oklahoma,
Right.
but also spoke Arabic. So he had an incredible entry to the like life there. And then he wrote a really good book about Lebanon called House of Stone. And then he died in Syria. He had an asthma attack actually, leaving Syria, and this was 2012. But that book, I felt like, not having been there myself, was a real education in terms of all the stuff you're talking about.
One of the things you can't do in these areas, and I know this you'll resonate with this, is you can't be an embedded reporter and even begin to scratch the surface at what's going on, because I would watch the embeds and I'm like, you have no idea what you're talking about. They'd write this story,
Hmm.
and other than the immediate interaction, they would often just be so far off base. They wouldn't have
Yeah.
and then they wouldn't seek out the people around that had the knowledge, like the interpreters who hear
Well,
everything,
and
you
this is
know?
one of the big, I mean, when I speak in front of journalism students and stuff like that, I mean, there's a couple things based on what you're saying that I think are really important for journalists who are working in, say, Iraq or Haiti or places like that. Number one, language. Like you've got to learn
Right.
the language if you want to actually talk to people. Translators are going to cut it. Number it creates a distance between you and someone else. If I was sitting here and someone was translating what I'm saying to you, it's not as direct a communication. And of course, if a bunch of armed dudes running down going on, you want to like ask. And number two, a lot of these neighborhoods in Port-au-Prince where I have a lot of time, you know, they have these reputations, probably similar to Sadr City, of being very dangerous and violent, etc. But of course, the people who are creating the danger and the violence, that's at most 10% of the population.
Right.
Most of the people there are just trying to live their lives and take care of their kids, and they, just want peace. Um, so uh, it's really, really important, I think, to, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it, make yourself vulnerable by going to those places, because those are the places where you need to hear what people have to say. You're not going to get that at the hotel bar. You're not going to around in a Humvee with the UN troops in Haiti or something like that. You really have to go and be among the people.
Yeah. And that means a considerable amount of what I would call miscomfort, because these people live this way, right? And so when I come all kitted up and with the platoon, I'm in a spaceship bubbling into an area. I'm not really getting what they are. It takes a lot more than that, and you have to be willing to, like, if some lady can sit on a street corner and have chai with her girlfriends or whatever it is, then you have to be willing to expose yourself to that same level of danger to have any chance of relating with them. Otherwise, it's it's just not possible. And I'm saying ladies and having chai, that doesn't have very much in the Middle East, at least where I was. But whatever that thing is, you go to the barber shop, you don't have a bunch of armor on and helmets and guns. You go in there and you like take your stuff off. You're like, hey, pardon me while I put my crap down and just be a regular dude. And you get a haircut and you
Yeah,
hang out and you listen to these guys talk.
yeah, and list occur during those kind of what you would call maybe downtime, not when you're actually formally interviewing somebody. But there's been lots of times when I've been sitting, for example, in Cité Soleil, talking to my friends, having a beer outside at a little shebeen, as they would call them in sub-Saharan Africa, a little informal bar, chatting, discussing what's going on. And you'll learn, incredible details about life on these places. And, I always say that when I was living in Haiti in the early Reuters, but I wasn't paid enough to buy a car, which pissed me off at the time. But what it meant was I had these taxis and what they call tap taps, these communal camionettes everywhere. And that turned out to be number one for my Creole at the time, a dude who looks like me getting into a big public transportation. I was just an object of curiosity. People were like, "Hey, what's your story, man?" So I could talk to people, but you would also be able to hear the kind of general discourse of people. What were they complaining about? Was the price of rice too high? Did they think the government was corrupt? Did they think they were good? Were they going to carnival, or was it too? And that, for me, that's, as a journalist, that's the information you really need.
Yeah, I can't. I just want to like push the like button over and over and over again because so I was basically a spy, which in effect is a reporter, and I'm trying to find out what's going on in the
Okay.
community. And so I want to do that sometimes just through observation. I just want to hear what's normal and what the vibe is. And by just listening a lot more than I talk, I'm going to find things out. And by being interesting and by being curious of what's important to them, one of my favorite questions to ask someone in a conflict zone is what's your opinion, of whatever it is. And then you just start to gather these opinions, and that stuff is gold because the guy might be pissed off that day. The guy might be in a great mood. He might lie, whatever. But when you continue to ask that question and empower that person to tell you what they think, oh my God, I would learn so much stuff from that.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, that's certainly. I mean, we're focusing on Haiti specifically at the moment. It was also my experience in Congo and Mexico and Guatemala, Brazil, some of these other places I worked, Kashmir, between India and Pakistan as well. Um, and it's one thing that I think has been difficult is in the last 20 years, there has been a diminution of foreign reporting in the sense of some places, like for example, in the early 2000s, sometimes I would a string, in other words, like work informally, send an article from time to time to like New York Newsday. And at the time I was working with them, I think they had eight foreign bureaus. Now they have none.
Yeah.
And so, and it's places like that, places like Haiti or Iraq, you can't just show up and know what's going on. You need to like really kind of commit. And I think nowadays, you have a situation where young journalists they're in a much more tenuous situation than I probably was when I was in my 20s, and makes, the pressures on them is more, and it makes their reporting more difficult.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about that and the challenges of operating safely. I mean, if you belong to a bureau, there is something looking out for you if something happens, someone to check in with, someone, just someone who maybe has a kidnap and ransom policy, on you. But nowadays it's much more freelance and the editorial part. I often see stories in areas that I know and I'm like, they just have no idea what they're talking about. And I wonder, like, if we've also lost that bureau chief kind of thing where they're like, "Hey, you're not putting this in our paper. Like, this is not anywhere near right." What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that? Like that expertise, that
yeah.
resident knowledge, that also, I mean, you can send someone there, but like you said, they're completely unprovisioned.
Yeah, and just as I said, you develop a knowledge about a place over a sustained period that you can't have just jetting in and out of there. I mean, it's just understanding a country and reporting on a country properly. It's a whole range of things. It's not just focusing on like the politics of the day. It's also the culture. It's the economy. It's the way different parts of town interact with one another. One thing that's common in a lot of places in the world, for example, is you see a lot of places that think, okay, the capital city is sucking up all the money and all the advantages, and here we are out in the hinterlands getting screwed, and nothing changes for us. And there's a and also I would say the politics of resentment can be very powerful. like Nayib, who's the president of El Salvador right now, who was elected 2 years ago. I interviewed him when he was mayor of San Salvador, the capital, about, I guess now 4 years ago. One of the things that swept him into power was that the people in El Salvador were sick of the two traditional parties, the FMLN, which is the and Arena, which is the party of the sorry, FMLN is the party of the left, Arena is the party of the right. And so this guy who was running with basically a tiny party became president. Now he's been pretty uh, mixed, I would say, would be generous, record since he got into office. But that's much the way that, say, Hugo Chavez first was elected in Venezuela. People thought the system wasn't working for them, and they were like, okay, let's take a gamble on whoever. And what I find about these kind of charismatic political figures is that's always a bad bet. Like whenever you gamble on a guy who's like, I'm gonna just burn it all down and take revenge for you, they get all that power and they never give it back. And that's what I always warn people. And that's not an ideological thing, because you
Right.
see people on the right doing it too, like Orban in Hungary and people like that. I would say like my just instinct is whatever the mob is like calling for, whether it's left wing or right wing, that's an immediate signal to me to be suspicious because I'm a big institutionalist guy. Like I said, I believe in strengthening institutions. I believe in having a system that's responsive to the people. So when people come up and they're like, "Oh, don't worry about all that stuff. I'm just going to do it all myself." I mean, the alarm bells start going off.
Right. Right. One of the things about our ability to stabilize as a nation was we had things like the post office that could provide some sense of national existence to someone as remote as can be.
Yeah,
And, that slowly sort of wove us together. And these things are often lacking in other places. It's just these
I,
simple
I
things.
always I always
Yeah.
tell people the three things that feel me make me feel most like a citizen in the States: the post office, voting, and going to the library. Like there are three things that like I feel, and I'm not a. Let me put it this way: I'm always like I'm patriotic. I'm not national. For me, there's a
Yeah.
difference between those two things. And like patriotism, you owe something to the country to try and make it better. Whereas nationalism for me is more like I was born on third base already, so I have all these advantages.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, when I was living in Miami years ago, I mean, I was literally I've been very working class, lower middle class most of my life, and I was at one point too poor to afford the deposit to get internet in my apartment, and I would go to the library in Little Haiti and work there for the afternoon, basically, on their Wi-Fi. And those three things for me are like I think they're I mean we've crumbled a lot of our what's our collegiality as a country, but I think those three things thankfully still exist, at least, so we got that.
I have to get on my soapbox for a second and say,
Okay.
I think jury duty should be one of those things too. We have the wrong
Right.
attitude. We push, 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 push voting, and it's of the civic duties. It's probably the least important. Sitting on a jury and allowing us to judge us as opposed to some bureaucrat
Yeah.
or somebody else, I think is one of the most important responsibilities we can. And this is our government. We should be involved in it beyond jury duty. We should be,
Yeah.
strengthening
Yeah.
institutions through our actions. And we we don't realize how, I mean, when you see it not work somewhere else, you're like, oh my God, we really gotta, we have to step forward and be on this committee or volunteer in this group to whatever it is, so that you can. I mean, voting once every couple of years is nothing. You go sit on a committee, you vote every time you guys meet multiple times, and it's like you want to vote and get in front of
Yeah.
something. Don't be handed the things you finally get to vote on.
Yeah, and
Go into the things that go on the ballot.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also, I mean, yeah, like I mean, echoing what I said before and what you're saying now, I am a big proponent of people feeling like they have a responsibility to their society. That not that necessarily like because it's one criticism I have of both the left and the right in the United States is on various issues. There's this idea of my rights, and it's like okay, we all have rights, but what about responsibilities? We all as citizens have responsibilities too, not just abandon our neighbors. So I mean, I don't know how in the kind of my writing or whatever you went in. I piss off both the left wing and the right wing all the time,
That's why I like you.
and I'm fine with it basically. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And that's sort of your job, is to be like, this is where the bullshit is, but I know enough from seeing enough that I know that it's on both sides. This is not
Yeah.
nobody has the solution exclusively. This is going to require, and this is one of my big things in general, is if you can't build consensus, you can't lead. And that's at a
Mhm.
national level or a county level. So you have to try to figure out ways to build consensus with people so you can get more than 51% of you to go, that's actually what we're going to do. Because if you can't, the argument must continue until you can say enough is enough. We're going in this direction.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, because where I'm from in Pennsylvania is an area called Lancaster County, which is kind of between Philly and Baltimore. I don't know if you've ever been here, but
Sure.
I think many think on a county level, it's positive, but at the same time, the city of Lancaster City per capita accepts more refugees than anywhere else in the United States, and it's a great multicultural area. People get along, and there's no beyond not resentment. There's like a big idea of, okay, this diversity is making us stronger. This is great. We're all citizens of Pennsylvania. We're all Americans, and I think that's somebody who's lived in New York and New Orleans and Miami and all of these places, I really feel that, for me at least, that diversity is strength. It's not something to be afraid of.
I'm going to push you back on that a little bit, just because I think there's room to work with here, and I think we'll agree in principle on these things. Diversity is great. Diversity for the sake of diversity becomes the antonym of unity. And so you need to be able to balance the diversity with that unity you talked about in Lancaster County, and that takes work, that takes effort. Like, hey, how do we not inculcate, but include these people into our world to not only get the benefit of their presence, but also, have them feel welcomed into our community. It's easy to just continue to divide, but then you end up with a tribal society that there's never enough for anybody, because everybody's out to get everybody else because nobody gets enough.
But that's the thing that I always particularly liked about the United States is like anyone can become an American. Like there is no, I totally reject this whole blood and soil. Like I'm from, because I mean my relatives were like French and German, I don't know,
Yeah.
200 years ago who came over here. So I'm, and compared to Native Americans, I'm a new arrival too, and I think that's something that we have thus far been able to avoid in a way that some nations in Europe have not. For example, I mean, you have I don't know if you were ever in the ball when you were in the service, but you have that discourse that goes on there, like, well, this village is Serbian and this village is Croatian and whatever. And I always like the idea of, hey, if you come here and you play fair and you pay your taxes, fine by me. What church you worship at or don't worship at, I don't care, where you come from. And that's something that, like, I wish was highlighted a little bit more, maybe in our discourse in the States.
For sure, for sure. And I think it's using the United States as a compare and contrast so we can see our own challenges with this diversity and unity and, equity and all these things that we talk about today. We're pretty damn good at it overall. You don't got to go very far out of our country to find problems with that. South America, Central America, they struggle quite a bit with a lot of these kind of problems, having enough, figuring out how to regulate themselves. And I'll just say this in general, and this is my view from talking to a lot of folks at work, and look back at the US, we create a lot of these problems. Okay, we import a lot of drugs. That creates a clientele base and a business base, and that business base has, tiers off of it. We also export things like guns
Yeah.
and all kinds. So we create these problems with our power, our wealth, our consumption. We create these businesses that have to exist, but create instability problems. And we'd like to offshore instability if at
Well,
all possible.
but yeah, and I mean, I wrote a book in 2014 that was a history
Yeah.
of the Cartel de Gulf, of the Gulf Cartel in Mexico. And I said in that book, okay, everybody says Mexico is a drug problem, but we provide the market, we sell them the guns, and we launder the money in our banks. So I think we have a drug problem too. I mean, it's not like if no one here was buying huge amounts of narcotics, there would be no cartels because there'd be no profit margin. What they'd be doing something else. And that's why, and I mean, quite frankly, it is a really hard job in Mexico to be an honest of the political system. And I always point stuff like this out. It's not also just in Mexico. I mean, in Texas, corruption. And one thing that always blows my mind is that, Rick Perry, who was the governor of Texas, was really good friends with Thomas Yarrington, who was the governor of Tamaulipas, which is right across the Rio Grande from like McAllen and Brownsville, Texas. And Thomas Yarrington was, famously like not just getting kickbacks from the Gulf Cartel, but was basically like a boss of the Gulf Cartel. And if I knew that as a journalist working at the time, I'm sure the governor of Texas had some idea of that. And you have this situation where if you're going to be an honest, I mean, it's putting a target on your head to do that in Mexico. And it's sad because what was viewed as maybe 15 years ago, you would have a big killing and that would be shocking news in Mexico. Like, oh my God, I can't believe they killed those 10 people in Zacatecas or whatever. Now that shit happens every week. And it's not even, when was the last time you read about one of those killings in the English language press? Doesn't make big news, and we've almost normalized our complicity in that killing, And I always tell people like, I mean, God knows I've been no angel in my life and I don't claim to be, but I tell people, when you're snorting a line of coke, you're basically snorting dead babies, man. And if you saw what I saw in Tamaulipas and Ciudad Juarez and places like that, you would not do it because the cost is too terrible.
Yeah, yeah. And just want to take a moment for everybody directly over to michaeldeibert's.com website. So it's just Michael Deibert, or you can spell it Deibert. So EI, that's the important part, michaeldeibert's.com. Books, all kinds of things there, and just fascinating. And Michael's been all over the world. If you're going to support the Break It Down Show, go to breakitdownshow.com, click on the PayPal link, and just between you and me, put a little bit of money in each month, and I'll put that money back into the show, whether it's equipment or a tank of gas and I hit the road. That's how you guys can support me. A lot of folks say, hey, why don't you use Patreon? I'll tell you why not. I don't need Patreon. I need you. They take a cut of that money. Then you got to push people to pay. I want you right here where we are having this conversation. And so that's how you can support me. All right. With that said, these are big things. One of the things that I talked to a drug trafficker recently, and he said the perception of our loss of religion makes us targetable in Mexico. So because we have all this sloth and all of these primal sins available, and then we've largely gone no religion, at least externally, that's the view. It's okay to send us fentanyl. And they don't care because, hey, we deserve the pain that we're causing ourselves. And so no one's going to stop it. And that really struck me because we can appear to be, I mean, look, I've been in places where they have theocracies and they are definitely a lot more conservative than we are. Do you think, does that resonate with you? Is our separation that we start to get further and further away from a religious body? Does that create danger for us?
I mean, no, I've never heard a narco talk in those kind of terms. It's more they want money,
Yeah.
and they don't really think about the whole they deserve fentanyl or whatever. It's just like fentanyl is making me money. My grandfather actually was a Lutheran minister he spent many years in Argentina and Puerto Rico and then New York and then came back to Pennsylvania. So, it's funny. I mean, he was an interesting guy because he was obviously, he was a Lutheran minister. So he obviously had a very close relationship with God. But at the same time, he was not, how can I say it? He did not try to impose his religious belief, aside from like preaching every Sunday or whatever. I think, again, going back to like systemic and structural problems, I think the fact that, there is such a level of impunity in Mexico, especially not just in Mexico either. I mean, the outgoing president of Honduras, I mean, was, I mean, his brother was arrested for being a major narco, and there were a whole bunch of things that were tying the president of Honduras to his brother. And so, it's a level. And I mean, AMLO, Andres Manuel López Obrador, who's the president of Mexico now, I found city and was extremely skeptical of him. And when he was elected a couple of years ago, he portrayed himself as this, I'm a very progressive leftist. All of these people who weren't familiar with his background, who were left wing, were basically like, "Oh yeah, I'm low," and I'm like, "You're going to regret that." And now, women are getting killed left and right, journalists are getting killed left and right. And his explanation at his press conference, he's like, "It's a neoliberal plot to make me look bad," And I'm like, some reporter in Tijuana, or Veracruz, just got gunned down. I think it's all about you, So that's the level of delusion, impunity, entitlement that good actors in Mexico are working against, and it's really tough. And I mean, across administrations in the United States, Democrat or Republican, I'm talking at the presidential level, is that they mince words about these guys who we all know are bad. And when I mean, you look at a country like Honduras, and the last two governments in Honduras have, by any means, any measures, been terrible, on drug trafficking, on human rights, on whatever. But, people basically give them a pat on the head and a pass. And that to me is bothersome. But then again, I guess you don't get to be president of a bullshit artist anyway. So
That's true. One of the things I wonder, so I'm pretty hard on our presidential capability for foreign policy. They seem to think this stuff is easy, and it's just simple. It's not. I mean, just you look at, we're obviously obsessed with the Middle East. We are always trying to fix what's there, and you just look south of our border, and there's probably an equal amount of instability. It may not make the news because it doesn't, that news doesn't sell, but it sure as hell sells in Syria when there is a civil war problem. But we can find civil war is not very far from here, and we don't seem to give a damn about it. So in terms of foreign policy, where do you, I mean, what's your sense of it? Where should we be paying? Look, we're US, we're going to be worldwide, but where should we really focus our efforts? Should we,
I mean,
we're going to send a whole shitload of people and stuff to the Ukraine, and we just left Afghanistan. Like, oh, okay, we'll just put that stuff on a railhead and send it north. But where should we be focusing, do you think?
yeah, and I'm going to, I'm going to say something now that might be controversial, but it's not the first time. I mean, for me personally, I don't know, if I can ever forgive Trump and Biden for abandoning Afghanistan in the way they did, for a couple reasons. Number one, as someone who was in New York on 9/11 and saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center, I don't think the Taliban have changed at all from the people who hosted Al Qaeda back then and killed a bunch of the people who lived in my city. The humanitarian cost, I mean, of course, Afghanistan wasn't perfect, but the minimal presence that we had allowed many, many thousands of people to live somewhat of a normal life. Women could participate in society, and that has been completely lost. They like destroyed the country. So that's something that I always hammer away at. And both partisans of both of the guys hate me for it, basically. And another thing that I find across administrations that's completely befuddling to me, like, okay, Iran is completely run by a demented theocracy that sponsors militias that ethnically cleanse Syria, that do all of the, that kill a whole bunch of people in Yemen and all that stuff. But so is Saudi Arabia. Hello, country named after a family. Right. I mean, and Saudi Arabia is also, I would say, a very bad actor in the Middle East. As is Iran. And the idea that we have this very like quiet, diplomacy with Saudi Arabia, who dismembered a U.S. resident journalist, who who took him into a consulate and cut him apart, is just, it's a really vivid example of the kind of hypocrisy and double standard that various administrations have in the States. And I don't know, maybe it's because of oil or whatever. I mean, I'm not an expert in the Middle East. I'm talking about it now, but I certainly know I can't speak about it with the authority that I can some other countries. And tracking back a little bit to your original question, I kind of digressed a little bit there in terms of why don't we pay attention to these conflicts in Latin America, for example. And that's something I often ask myself. I mean, Latin America was obviously a big story in the 1980s when it was viewed as a struggle between communism and in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and places like that. And you have situations now where, for example, in Colombia, okay, the FARC surrendered, basically, and became a political party. The left-wing guerrillas in Colombia. You still have the ELN, which is another organization around. You don't have the huge, big narcos like Pablo Escobar and the Cali Cartel, but what you do have is smaller groups with connections to political actors in Colombia that are still moving a lot of drugs. And I guess one of the reasons is that's a good story. To have to go into the whole nitty gritty of the dynamics of Colombian politics and things like that, it's not as easy as just being like, oh, there's this one guy who's like a billionaire who's in Forbes and he's running the whole show. But I don't think to your average Colombian, although certainly it's good that you can drive from Medellin to Bogota now and not get kidnapped by the FARC. There's still a tremendous amount of violence in more rural areas, mostly, but also sometimes in cities like Cali, sometimes in Medellin. And I think, we've become so, as a society, we have a very, everyone's glued to their phones. They want instant gratification. They want the dopamine rush from getting likes on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever. And people don't really want to put in the work to understand those complicated problems. And as a journalist, it can be frustrating because, to me, but a lot of society doesn't seem to think it is so much.
As you describe all this stuff, and I think about, like, I got really, really good at war and doing the spy thing. So I would come back in from being out in the field, and you have to stay connected to the American side because I've got to transmit all this reality to them in a way that they can accept it. And so that involves having their trust. And just because I've got the uniform on doesn't mean that anybody is going to give me the time of day. So you've got to balance the here and there when you deal in instability zones. And the other part of this thing that's interesting, and I think as a reporter, you're going to go out to a place. So they would ask me like, hey, and we want you to go to Village 15 and figure out what's going on over there. Can you tell us the answer by, I don't know, tomorrow? And you're like, no, I can't. There's no way to do that. Not only can I not do it, you don't realize how preposterous that is. Like, I cannot go in a week and get you these answers. I'm not magic. The reason why I know this is because I've done nonstop work. I've talked to a ton of people. I've thought. So this stuff for me I begin to understand in 3 weeks, and I have an area where I build trust and I'm introduced to other people outside of where I could ever find. At about 3 to 6 months, those things start to happen where I start to be a valuable person in the community, and they kind of trade me off. 3 to 6 months. If I'm a reporter and I'm going to go work somewhere for 3 to 6 months and I come back and I have to sell the story and I'm selling it for $12,000, that's not a living. And I don't know what reporters get paid for a story like that where you go out and do it, but that seems untenable. I mean, especially for a young kid who's like, I have to eat,
Yeah. Well, I mean, they get paid a lot less than $12,000. I can tell you that.
Right.
Unfortunately, and that's what I mean. One of the pieces of advice I give sometimes to young journalists. I mean, there are kind of two routes you can go. You can get a route in a newsroom, sitting at a desk, that will probably be more financially secure. You're probably not making that much money, but you probably have health insurance and benefits and things like that. Or if you really want to be out in the field and if you want to be a storyteller more than a journalist per se, pick somewhere that's interesting to you, where there's not a whole bunch of other journalists. For example, if you want to be a journalist and you want to move to, say, Guatemala or something like that, well, you can have a lot lower overhead living in Guatemala than you would in Manhattan or Los Angeles. I mean, obviously. So I don't think a bad bet. The trick is getting a lot of reliable places to take multiple stories, because it comes, and I speak from experience here, it's very much like living by your wits. Month to month, am I going to make enough money kind of situation, which, the older you get, the more stressful it gets. obviously. I mean, it's not so much when you're young, you can kind of live in semi-squalor and it doesn't bother you that much. But when you get into your 40s, it's much you want a little bit more stability.
Yeah, and that makes it really hard to know an area, to get accurate reporting, to actually have someone who cares about the struggles of Ecuador, for example. Like, hey, can I even sell this story? And when I sell it, like you said, it's not $10,000. And so it takes you months and months. That means you've got to constantly be selling stories. And again, if you're not here in the States, you've got to have advocates who are like, hey, we're going to buy Michael's story no matter what, because he's doing good work and we want the whole body of it over time. But that patronage is tough to find if you're a reporter, and that makes it tough for us to even understand what's going on. I mean, you probably could employ 1 million reporters and send them all over the earth and find stories that shock us, except for that there's no money in it.
Yeah, and I think even when you get to kind of staff reporters who are reporters with major publications, to me it's really unfair to you know to have someone in Mexico and be like, okay, you're responsible for covering all of Central America and the entire Caribbean. I mean, that's not possible. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not possible to stay up to speed on all of those countries. So yeah, I mean, and I feel also like at this moment in time, we need to be more informed about the world than ever before. I mean, it's amazing too. There's a place in the misinformation universe of social media where the far left and the far right touch. You know,
Yeah.
uh, they become like extremely pro Russia, pro Putin, and I'm like, I asked both sides. Okay, when I was growing up, I'm 48 years old now. The GOP, the Republicans, were the most skeptical of Russia's intention. They were very much like, okay, we have to be on guard. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, all this stuff, all of which I agree with. And the left were very much like, okay, human rights are important. Those things are important. So none of those things are represented by Putin's Russia. It certainly isn't a human rights like paradise, and they certainly, I don't think, have the best interests of the United States at heart. But to see these two extremes basically start cheerleading for this like 5'6" dictator ex KGB FSB guy is really, that shows, I think, the powerful. What was Mark Twain's saying? Like, a lie travels halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its socks.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly. Or
You
pants
really
or
see
whatever.
that. And another
Yeah.
place, yeah, if I'm not over talking too much, another 59. Okay, it's been ruled by three white guys since 1959: Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, and Miguel Diaz-Canel. I've been to Cuba a bunch of times. I met Fidel Castro. I met a lot of opposition people. It's hard to find a more reactionary, racist government than the one that exists in Cuba. And most of the people that they're throwing in jail and that they're beating up are poor black and brown people. Some of whom are my friends. Some of the dissidents I know are friends of mine. And you still have people buying into this narrative that, Cuba, it's this revolutionary paradise, it's all this stuff. And I'm like, guys, it's a bunch of old white guys guarding their hotels. That's what it is now. It's like a couple families guarding their hotels. Of the way that social media works, that you can disseminate all of these falsehoods. A lot of people still believe that bullshit, which is unfortunate.
When you said the whole thing about being a reporter who covers, Central America and the Caribbean, I got to thinking, Central American Caribbean, they probably have, let's say, 100 million people combined between the two spaces across a couple of dozen countries, some of them protectorates, some of them countries outright. And for sure, bigger than the size of Texas. So you're talking about something that's like the population of New York, California, Texas, and then a whole bunch of other states, and
Yeah.
a massive space. I mean, there's no way one person could ever do that effectively, if they could even name all the damn countries involved and all the
Yeah.
players involved. It's too big to legitimately cover that.
And I've always felt like, for a minimum, you would have like, okay, one correspondent for Central America and then a separate correspondent for the Caribbean. That would be, I feel like, the maximum any human can do. Because I mean, even just the Caribbean. I mean, people think it's a small space, but it's like, okay, you're keeping track of the political dynamics of Cuba, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Tobago, all of these places, which are very different. I mean, and have a whole bunch of different issues going on, different languages. Just covering that, you're talking about 3 different languages, for example. And when you get into and then there's the whole, like, the Lesser Antilles, as they call them, Barbados, St. Vincent, places like that. So yeah, I mean, it's a very it's not an easy job, for sure.
Is it doable?
Yeah, I think if one thing that I think is really important is I always urge reporters to do this, is you can't just base your work on kind of a collection of recent articles. You got to read the history. You got to read the fiction. I mean, oftentimes, the fiction of countries can tell you every bit as much about it in the national character as any kind of book of history you're going to read. And in my books, I always make a point of incorporating the way that the countries are written about by their own writers, their own fiction writers, their own poets, things like that. And I don't know if that interests a lot of people sometimes, because it's a lot of work, but I think it's really key. I mean, I would not be able to have whatever understanding of Haiti I have if I hadn't read Jacques-Stephen Alexis, Lionel Triot, authors like that who taught me a whole lot about the perception of the country from within Haiti itself.
Yeah, I'm reading some of Buddy Levy's work. I don't know if you know Buddy's work, but he writes a lot about the conquistadors. And we have this perception that, Columbus came, killed a bunch of people, and then the next thing happened. But there's like all kinds of people involved in this. And it was crazy and it was hairy, and to survive was impossible. And you start to read that and you realize just how complex history was 600 years ago. And how dangerous the world was. And now we're trying to project simple A-B answers to something that has never been simple. It's never been easy to survive. We have a different form of that struggle, but it opens your eyes when you start to read the history of, in this case, the Amazon and a bunch of dudes who floated down, the river system and went, wow, we can't even go there. We can't go there. We're starving. I mean, there were so many problems. They couldn't even do an accurate survey because it just wasn't possible to even do an accurate survey of that time. You just have glimpses of what history was.
You're reminding me of one of my favorite movies is this movie, The Mission. I don't know if you've ever seen it, with Robert De Niro, about so it's about the kind of, these priests basically in the Amazon in the whenever it was, but I think it's from like maybe 1985 or 1986, but it discusses a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. It's really worth watching if you have a chance.
Yeah, it definitely gives you a sense of things. All right, so I don't want to keep you all day, and it's been fascinating talking to you, and I can't wait to have you back on. Maybe, I don't know if you know Todd Bensman's work, but he's another guy I'd love to have you guys on together, because you've covered stuff south of the border so well. But just in terms of Haiti, what do you want to close with in telling us about it? Because we just often, until something else horrible happens there, which is imminent, we forget that Haiti even exists. It kind of bugs me.
Haiti is a nation composed of incredibly heroic people who are fighting every day for survival that I think many Americans can hardly comprehend. And I think, it's really important that we support them in that struggle. We can support them. We can't replace them. They need allies. They don't need replacements. And I think, we need to see how we can help them fight against the system of impunity that has damaged the country so much. And also, it's an amazing place. People get a chance to visit there. It's in terms of cuisine, music, literature, art. The beaches are great. The mountains are amazing. Go for it, I would say.
Cool. And then everybody should go to michaeldeibert.com. And that's where all the stuff is, the books, the articles, everything is available there. Hey, man, I really appreciate you coming on. Let me roll this thing. Stand by.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.